Well, there's lots going on this week here at Forest View. As has been alluded to multiple times, it is Holy Week, which is kind of the fancy name for just saying it's the week leading up to Easter. And so as Cole alluded to, on Friday, we've got Good Friday. I cannot wait to go on this hike at Crawford Lake with all of you. I've heard about it, but I've never gotten to experience it for myself, so I'm excited. If you've never been and you're like, what's this all about? We're going to find out together. It's going to be a good time. So please come and be a part of that. And then on Sunday, we're going to blow the roof off this place with some baptisms and just celebrating the fact that Jesus is alive, that the tomb was empty, that there is resurrection. But as we've been working our way towards that, we've been navigating a series just simply titled Introductions and Invitations. And we've been looking at Jesus, how he introduces himself throughout the Gospel of John with the various different statements where he simply says, I am, and he gives us a picture of who he is. And coinciding with each one of these introductions is an invitation for us to walk in relationship with Jesus. He gives us metaphors, he gives us pictures of who he is and what it means to be in relationship with him. And so we've been looking at these pictures together as a community with the hope that this will help deepen our understanding about what it means to walk with Jesus and to be his disciple. And so this morning, I want to start by reading our passage. It's found in John chapter 15. We're going to be reading up from verse 1 to verse 11. And so if you've got a Bible on your phone or you've got like the analog version, I invite you to just open it up and let's look at this passage together. The words are on the screen if you don't have that, but if you've got it, I think there's real value in just having the text right in front of you. So would you join me in reading this? I'll do it out loud. You can do it quietly. I am the true vine, and my Father is the vine dresser. Every branch in me that does not bear fruit, he takes away. And every branch that does bear fruit, he prunes, that it may bear more fruit. Already you are clean because of the word that I have spoken to you. Abide in me, and I in you. As the branch cannot bear fruit by itself unless it abides in the vine, neither can you unless you abide in me. I am the vine, you are the branches. Whoever abides in me and I in him, he it is that bears much fruit. For apart from me, you can do nothing. If anyone does not abide in me, they are thrown away like a branch that withers. And the branches are gathered, thrown into the fire and burned. If you abide in me and my words abide in you, ask whatever you wish and it will be done for you. By this my Father is glorified, that you bear much fruit, and so prove to be my disciples. As the Father has loved me, so have I loved you. Abide in my love. If you keep my commandments, you will abide in my love, just as I have kept my Father's commandments and abide in his love. These things I have spoken to you, that my joy may be in you, and that your joy may be full. Well, for those of you who don't know, I kind of got my start in youth ministry, and over the last number of years I've been, and before I came to Forest View, I was serving as a youth and young adults pastor at a church in Kitchener-Waterloo. And this passage, when it kind of came up in this series, was something that stuck out to me because my last time looking at this passage with a group of young adults, it elicited a very interesting conversation with one of the people who were in attendance. This particular young woman, she was a brilliant university student, and she had essentially been dragged to this group. And we were looking at this passage together in this group, where essentially I was speaking on it. And afterwards, I introduced myself to her and was talking with her. And one of the things that she said, I don't buy it. And I said, well, you don't buy what? Because it was just, I wasn't really sure what she was talking about. And she said, that passage that you read, said all this stuff about vines and abiding and apart from me doing nothing. And she essentially said that. She said, I'm not a Christian. I don't believe in any of this stuff. In fact, I don't even know if there is a God or any sort of higher being or purpose in life. But she said, I'm doing just fine. Everything is going well for me. I'm achieving the success I want. I'm working really hard, and I'm getting the results that I want for what I'm putting into it. And I didn't really know what to say to her, quite honestly. It wasn't a conversation I was exactly ready to have. But I appreciated her honesty and her just how upfront she was about the whole thing. Because I know for me, at different times, I've encountered this passage, and in some ways, I have felt a very similar way. sometimes when I think about my life and the way that life looks for me, or I look at other people who aren't Christians and aren't walking with Jesus, and yet I look at their life and I just go, apart from me, you can do nothing. That's something that Jesus says, but they don't know Jesus. They have no interest in following Jesus, and yet things seem to be going pretty good for them. And even when I'm honest, sometimes in my own life, I'm a pastor, I'm doing this for a living, and yet at various different times, I realize how far away my relationship with Jesus is from everything else that is going on in my life. How many of us have had an experience where someone says, hey, you pray for me, and we say, okay, sure, I'll pray for you, and then we don't actually end up praying for them? And a week goes by, and they're like, oh, God answered this prayer. And we're kind of like, oh, that's great. I'm glad to hear that. We were praying for you, or at least we should have been. And it's that awkward sort of experience. For many of us, we can carry on in our lives just as we are, with little to no change. Jesus says that apart from him, we can do nothing, but we seem to be doing all right on our own. At least that's how it can feel. This morning, I want to dive into this passage, and I want to look at what it means to abide in Jesus. Because I think one of the things that we can bring to this passage, especially on first hearing, is to miss what Jesus is truly inviting us into, and what the nothing is that he is truly addressing. And so my hope is that as we just look at this passage together, we'll come to a deeper understanding around what's really going on there. And we'll look at what it really means to abide and why that's something that we as Christians should pursue, and why that should, or why that does, make a difference in our lives. So let's go back to John chapter 15, and we'll just be starting at verse 1. Here's what Jesus says. He says, I am the true vine, and my Father is the vine dresser. So here Jesus is using this language. He's using a vineyard language. Now for you, maybe, for me, I should say first off, is that I sometimes get this image a little bit wrong in my head, because I hear vine, and I think of like that annoying thing that grows up the side of my house that I have no control over. And it starts off, it's just sort of spindly and whatever it is. And then when I hear branches, I think about the tree in my backyard and these massive fat branches. And so sometimes what I will do is I will mix those two things up. The vine is like this wimpy thing that just sort of grows, and the branches are big, strong things. But the imagery that Jesus is using here is from a vineyard. And so it has different meaning than maybe the vines and the branches that we are typically experiencing. First, I've got a picture just up here on the screen. This is some grapes on the vine. And so you'll notice that there are grapes, and then there are essentially these offshoots, which are what they refer to as being the branches. And then you'll notice essentially there is the big vine there. That is the source. That is the thing that gives all of the life and sustenance to the various different branches, so that those branches are able to produce fruit. Now, Jesus here is speaking to a group of Jewish people, or at least predominantly Jewish people. And so one of the things that he's saying here is he talks about how he is the true vine. This language for vine was used at numerous times throughout the Old Testament to describe the people of Israel and their calling to be essentially a light to the world. They are often referred to as being the vine, out of which comes nourishment and sustenance. And Jesus grabs a hold of this image, but he twists it and he inverts it and he puts himself at the center of it, saying that, no, you had this vision that Israel was actually the true vine. But he says, if you want to understand, or Israel was the vine, but actually to really understand who the true vine is, you need to look at me. This is what Jesus invites his people into. He's giving them a picture of him being the source, of him being the place where they find their sustenance, their life. Skip ahead to verse 4. Jesus states this, abide in me and I in you. As the branch cannot bear fruit by itself unless it abides in the vine, neither can you unless you abide in me. I am the vine, you are the branches. Whoever abides in me and I in him, he it is that bears much fruit. For apart from me, you can do nothing. And so Jesus gives the people this picture of an image. He essentially says, you're the branch. And again, we might look at this when we think of a vine, but Jesus actually looks at this and he says, no, this is the branch. And the branch has all these wonderful leaves on it. and it grows, but the second it gets trimmed off, it gets removed from the vine, it begins to wither and die. It doesn't matter how much fruit it has produced in the past. It doesn't matter how big or how beautiful it looks. When it is not connected to the vine, the branch begins to die. And it no longer is able to produce fruit. Instead, whatever is left of it begins to shrivel up, and it becomes worthless to the vine grower, and it gets discarded. To abide, Jesus is essentially saying, is to be connected to him. Now, I want to unpack this word abide a little bit more, because Jesus is using it in the context of framing it first off with this image of the branches, and they're abiding in the vine. But as we begin to understand what Jesus is talking about, he's not just saying you need to be close to me in proximity. He's speaking about something more profound than that. I love the way that Dallas Willard, who's a philosopher and a profound theologian, he states it this way. He says this: to abide is when we internalize the words of Jesus and put them into action. Now, a lot of the time, this term abide, it becomes kind of esoteric and out there, and it sort of almost seems to be used to describe as some sort of mystical experience. And for me, at various different times encountering this passage, I just don't know what to do with that because it's confusing and like, what does that mean? And so I love the way that Dallas Willard puts this, because it just grounds it in something that's concrete, something that I can understand, something that's not rooted in out there ideas and feelings, but rather is just in a very practical sense. To abide is when we internalize the words of Jesus and put them into action. The way that I like to frame it is in this way, is that the words of Jesus make their home in us, and we make our home in the words of Jesus. Let me read that again. To abide is when the words of Jesus make their home in us, and we make our home in the words of Jesus. Now, here's what that means. That means what Jesus says about who we are becomes the most important description for us understanding who we are. When who Jesus says we are becomes the most important and determinative voice in our life, when it shapes us and forms us. Many of us who've gone through school, you've encountered a rubric, right? The rubric is the thing that you are given, usually at the beginning of the assignment, to let you know what you need to do in order to achieve a good mark. And if you haven't received a rubric, usually teachers are supposed to have some sort of rubric to help grade you, to let you know, hey, what did you get right? What did you get wrong? I remember I had a professor in university, and I was convinced that they were not using any sort of rubric. You know, where you just get the assignments back, and you just go, why did I get this mark? It was like you could tell me they weren't using a rubric. I felt like they were just using like one of those bingo roller things. It's just like, all right, that's an A+. It's like, oh, and Nat Evans gets, a D+. Okay, next up, we got a C+. And that's essentially how it was like, what is driving these decisions? What is motivating their analysis of what is right and wrong? What is quality and what is lacking in quality? This is a rubric, something to lead and guide us. And for us as Christians, we are invited into, when we abide in Jesus, is to see Jesus' words as our rubric. Jesus' words that he speaks to us. This is who you are. This is what I see in you. This is who you are called to be. Jesus' words, commandments. This is what it means to be my disciple. This is what it looks like to follow me and to live for me. These are the things that you should be doing. These are the things you shouldn't be doing. This is what success looks like. This is what going the other way looks like. To abide is when the words of Jesus make their home in us and we make our home in the words of Jesus. This is not something that is rooted in feeling. Sometimes this will feel great. Sometimes this will feel difficult and hard, because there is so often we just have this temptation to base who we are and what is important to us and what our life is supposed to look like by comparing ourselves to others, or by rushing after the praise and the praise and the admiration of other people. I mean, how many of us, our decisions are focused by trying to please our parents or trying to please our kids or trying to live up to some sort of ideal version of ourselves that we've been fed through media or through watching other people. There's so many things competing for the rubric of our hearts, and Jesus invites us to abide in him. Some of us, we are deeply shaped by all the ways that we do not measure up. And so we are walking with this deep sense of failure in our hearts all the time. And then some of us, we are walking with actually the other thing happens, which is we've achieved success. And that's even worse because we constantly live with this experience of, what if people find out I don't really have it all together? Or what if I lose my job? Or what if my kid, I know I look like the super mom dad, what if my kid doesn't turn out the way that maybe I want or I think other people see? And so you live with this constant state of trying to keep up appearances and trying to keep the facade going. Or maybe it's just simply this acknowledgement or this awareness that things are really good, but it's also really fragile and it could crumble and fall apart any minute. I've got a picture of an athlete. His name is Ryan Hall. Ryan Hall is an American long distance runner, or at least he was. He retired a couple of years ago. He held the record for the fastest half marathon time for an American. And then later on, he ran the fastest marathon time for an American. I think it was like 2 hours and 4 minutes, which is just blows my mind that he's able to run that fast. However, it wasn't able to count as an official record because it was during the Boston and there was like a strong tailwind or something like that. So incredible runner. I think he placed something like 11th at the Beijing Olympics. Incredible athlete. And I came across an interview with him with a doctor on his podcast, a guy named Peter Attia. Peter Attia he's spoken with numerous different people and celebrities about longevity of life and achieving different physical performances as athletes. And this conversation was really interesting to me. Now, Peter Attia, as far as I know, no Christian belief or anything like that. He's engaging in this conversation with Ryan Hall, and this really interesting thing came up. Ryan Hall started to share about a season in his life, essentially in university, where he felt like he had hit a wall. He was navigating depression. He wasn't able to achieve the results he wanted to achieve as a competitive runner. He was carrying with him some deep shame and pain. And he goes on to share this, and I think this is just really important because this is a beautiful picture around what it means to abide. So let's watch this clip together.
I'm always very concerned with the nuts and bolts of training, what I'm doing, right? That's always my focus as an athlete. And yet the lesson that I've had to learn from the time I've gotten into sports since a kid until now at 39 is it's way more important how I do what I'm doing, meaning my heart condition, what's going on in my head, than what I'm actually doing. So for example, my tendency is to try to prove myself in training to myself. I'm not really trying to prove myself to anyone else. I just want to know I'm fit, I'm ready to go, right? So oftentimes I'll come to these workouts and I'm racing them. It's I'm going head down, all out, everything I have inside me. Oftentimes I'm going harder in training than I'm going in racing, right? And yet that is not the best way for my body to absorb the work. I need to be making deposits, not making withdrawals when I'm training. So if I go into these workouts confident in who I am, knowing the purpose of the workout, then I'm in a much better place. I'm absorbing the training a lot better. So what happened, to answer your question, was my identity was all wrapped up in my performances, right? And that's why I was struggling with depression. As I would look in the mirror in the morning, I was struggling with my running. I was hurt. I was frustrated with how things were going. I wasn't getting better. And so I just saw myself as a failure, and it's very difficult to have that happen every single morning. Get up, look in the mirror, failure, 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 And so when I went back home, my faith has always been a huge part of my life. And I started to realize I need to see myself how God sees me, and how God sees me has nothing to do with my performance, right? It's think about your kids, right? You don't really care how good they are at a certain sport, right? You love them,
right? It's unconditional,
who they are, yeah. And so can I love myself that same way, right? Oftentimes, like we're able to love other people and treat other people a lot better than we actually treat ourselves in our mind, you know? And so I started to kind of get to the bottom of that and be like, you know what? Like God loves me regardless of how I do. So I'm going to choose on a daily basis. It wasn't a one-time thing. It's still something I have to cultivate to this day of like, I'm gonna choose to love myself regardless of how I'm performing, right? Like what really makes me special has nothing to do with how fast I am or how much weight I can lift or any of those things. And as that began to sink in, it took all the pressure off myself. Like I was just carrying around this like heavy burden to every single workout, every single race. Because if I wasn't proving to myself that I was important by running fast, I was hating myself, right? And so as I took these weights off and be like, no, actually, I'm cool with who I am. Like, actually, I love myself, whether I have a great workout or a bad workout. That just took the weights off. And it also made me fearless too. It's like, okay, now I can go out and just air it out and I'm going to fail a bunch of times and I can live with that. I'm okay with that.
I love that picture of taking the weights off. And here we get a little glimpse from this athlete, just simply describing what it meant for him to abide in Jesus, for the words of Jesus to make their home in him, and for him to make his home in the words of Jesus. Now, sometimes that can get just boiled down to feelings. And one of the things that Jesus actually invites us into is to understand that it's not just simply about feelings. It's not just simply about some sort of esoteric self-love, but rather he grounds it in something else beyond just simply that. Notice John 15, verse 10, if you keep my commandments, you will abide in my love, just as I have kept my Father's commandments and abide in his love. Jesus here essentially invites us to abide in his commandments, essentially his words. So there are the words that Jesus says about us. This is who you are. Know that you are my beloved child. You are loved, not for your accomplishments and for your achievements. But then there's also this other side where Jesus is saying, and notice you were created to live for more, to follow me. Now in the Gospel of John, you will notice that Jesus does not have a whole lot about explicit moral teaching. If you read through the Gospel of Matthew, there's all sorts of teaching, the Sermon on the Mount, same with the Gospel of Luke. All these commands and callings for what the people of his followers are supposed to look like, whether it's navigating relationships with enemies, whether it's about forgiveness, whether it's about generosity, whether it's about pursuing justice. All these things are kind of laid out in all these different ways. But if you read through the Gospel of John, you will not find all these sorts of kind of teaching. At least it's not there in the same explicit sort of way. And yet that does not mean that John lacks commandments, that Jesus is not giving commandments. Rather, notice the things that Jesus makes explicit. Actually, just even surrounding this passage, if you go back 2 chapters before this, John chapter 13, Jesus has just washed his disciples' feet. He's taken on the humble, in a sense, humiliating role of being a servant, of washing their dirty feet. And here is what Jesus says to his disciples. Go to the next slide. If I then, this is Jesus speaking, your Lord and teacher have washed your feet, you also ought to wash one another's feet. For I have given you an example that you also should do, just as I have done to you. Jesus' command is, follow my example of sacrificial, self-giving love. Skipping a few verses ahead, Jesus says this. He gives a commandment. It's not the explicit kind that like I as a parent find myself sometimes giving to my children. He gives this general command, which is so far reaching and so much more profound than any specific instruction. Verse 34, 35, a new commandment I give to you, that you love one another just as I have loved you. You also are to love one another. By this, all people will know that you are my disciples if you have love for one another. And then just following this passage after Jesus has talked about the vine, notice he goes back one more commandment. In verse 12, he says this is my commandment that you love one another as I have loved you. Greater love has no one than this, that someone lay down his life for his friends. And then just a few verses later, Jesus says this, these things I command you so that you will love one another. To abide in Jesus is to make our home in his words and let his words make their home in us. And it is to do what he says, to live lives of sacrificial, self-giving love for others. And the word that he uses to describe what this means or what this produces is the word fruit. Now, for us, we often think about fruit as maybe being all of the good things that we do. And while that certainly is true, some of us, we think about fruit being accomplishments and achievements. Jesus has a very different way of looking at it. Fruit, I love the way that Leslie Newbegin, who's a theologian and biblical scholar and missionary, he says it this way: fruit is simply the life of Jesus being made visible in the midst of the life of this world. Maybe we could say it this way: it's when what's true about us internally, the work that God is doing in our hearts, it becomes visible externally. Where the health of the relationship of the vine to the branches begins to manifest by producing that relationship. It's when the love that Jesus has for us so shapes us and changes us that it's something that we begin to live out in concrete ways in our world. It's when what's true internally becomes visible externally. Which brings us back to this question. We've looked at what does it mean? What does it mean to abide? And what does it mean to follow the commandments? And why do we follow the commandments? Well, we follow it because we want to produce the fruit. We want what's true inside us to be expressed outwardly. But then this brings us to the questions we were looking at the beginning. What about the nothing? What about there's people out there who don't know Jesus, who are not connected to the vine, and yet we look at their lives and we go, what difference does it really make? They seem like they're nice, good, kind people. Well, John 5, let me just look at this passage. We'll review it one more time. John 15, verse 5. I'm the vine, you are the branches. Whoever abides in me and I in him, he it is that bears much fruit. For apart from me, you can do nothing. If anyone does not abide in me, he is thrown away like a branch and withers, and the branches are gathered, thrown into the fire, and burned. So not only is it an issue of, okay, it's the idea that, oh no, they can do nothing. There's also this element of like, oh great, now there's fire and burning and all that. And this is the stuff that makes many of us feel incredibly uncomfortable. Well, I want to focus in on this term, nothing, because I think it's something that's important for us to pay attention to. Again, Jesus is using this image of the vine, and he's explaining himself as being the true vine. Now for them, again, the Israelites, they would hear this image and they would think the people of Israel, and they're calling to be a light to the world and to show the world what the one true God is actually like, and to be an embodiment of his healing, transformative presence. And so what is essentially at the core of this is not saying that people who don't know Jesus can't be moral or nice or be successful or any of those different things. But what it is saying that is if we're working through the rubric of Jesus for what really matters and what has eternal worth and value, if it's not connected to the source, which is Jesus, then it's nothing. It's insignificant. Ultimately, it shrivels up and disappears. Jesus, throughout his ministry, is constantly referring to him. And the word that Jesus uses for nothing here in this part, he's talking about his relationship with his Father earlier on. And at various different times, he talks about how he can do nothing without his deep connection to his Father. Notice in John chapter 5, verse 19, Jesus says this, "Truly, truly, I say to you, the Son can do nothing of himself unless it is something he sees the Father doing. For whatever the Father does, these things the Son also does in the same way." And a few verses later, in verse 30, Jesus says, "I can do nothing on my own. As I hear, I judge, and my judgment is righteous, because I do not seek my own will, but the will of him who sent me." Jesus is not trying to say that people can achieve different things. In his world, there were all sorts of moral pagans. There were all sorts of leaders who were doing incredible things, or at least impressive things by the cultural standard. But what Jesus is saying is that to live a life that really truly matters and has eternal significance is to live by his rubric, to allow his words to shape you and to follow the way that he leads. And that's what real life is. One of the things that I've been learning in my life is that as I follow the way of Jesus, and as I engage in wanting to let his words change and transform me, both the way I see myself and the way that I see the rest of the world, in the way that I live and move and have my being, is that I'm learning that following Jesus can be difficult. It is awesome and incredible and amazing, but sometimes it is really hard. One of the things that I am learning more and more in my own life is that as I pursue the way of Jesus, I am becoming more and more aware of my need for Jesus. Maybe just say it this way in a more general way. As we pursue the way of Jesus, we become more aware of our need for Jesus. Because when I look at my life and I look at all the different rubrics that so easily take control of my heart and control how I see myself and how I see other people, I realize that so often I am living for a whole lot of nothing. That so much of what I do and who I am can become disconnected from Jesus and become so distant from who he has called me to be and the way that he leads us. And so part of my journey is just constantly going back and going, Jesus, what does it mean to follow you? What are the false rubrics that have grabbed a hold of my heart? Where am I abiding that is out of sync with your heart? What are the lies that I'm living into or allowing to seep into my heart that I need to be exposed to truth? When Jesus is essentially first introduced in the Gospel of John, there's a term that is used to describe what he is full of. And those two things he is described as being is full of grace and truth. John chapter 1, verse 14, and the word became flesh. Jesus came, dwelt among us, and we have seen his glory. Glory is the one and only Son from the Father, full of grace and truth. And just in case that didn't sink in, John goes on to say it again, just 3 verses later in verse 17. For the law was given through Moses, grace and truth came through Jesus Christ. As I continue to abide, as I continue to allow Jesus' words to transform and shape and be the rubric of my life, to make my home in those words, I become more and more aware of what the truth is, about the lies that I'm so easily giving myself over to and living into. But the amazing thing is, and in the midst of that, it's not more shame that's heaped on me as I come face to face with that truth. It's not more guilt that's heaped on me as I come face to face with all of my failings. Rather, I discover at the very bottom is grace. It's a gift. It's Jesus saying, hey, I know you've fallen short. Get back up. Keep on going. I'm not going anywhere. So maybe 2 questions I would just simply pose to you as individuals, one as individuals and one as a community. First question is this: where are you abiding? What are the rubrics that have found their way into your heart? It's questions around success, or what a good look at life looks like, or what should be most important to you. And then the second question I have for us is a corporate question. It's one I'm not going to answer today, but it's one that I want to begin to wrestle with, hopefully for the next 30, 40 years, which is this: where are we abiding as a church? Because so often our cultural rubrics around what success looks like, what achievement looks like, what a good church looks like, is not grounded in us making our home in Jesus and in Jesus' words, but rather in the praise and approval of the world around us. My hope and my prayer that as we pursue the way of Jesus and in the self-giving love that he invites us to both live into and to live out of, that we would be a community of sacrificial, self-giving love. That would be what drives us and leads us and guides us. And as we work out what that looks like at the little detail levels, that we would discover that there is something so much better there than just simply being a bigger church or a more influential church or a church with a whole lot of beautiful, popular people at it. Where are we abiding?